Masechet Baba Batra, Daf, Kof Gimel. We begin the seventh perek with the Mishnah. Ha'omer lechavero bet kod afar ani mocher lecha. Someone says, I'm going to sell to you one bet kod of earth. And now bet kod is a large amount. It's actually technically it's the amount of land for which you would sow a bet kod of seed. That amount of land is pretty large. To be exact, it's 75,000 square amot. Okay, so I'm selling you that much dirt, afar, presumably to plow and to plant on. And hayu sham nekaim amukim asarat tefachim. And the problem is that on that land, within that big plot of land, there are crevices that are more than 10 tefachim deep. Or selaim gevohin asarat tefachim. Or there are rocks that are more than 10 tefachim high, higher than the rest of the ground. Enan nimdadin imaha. Those deep areas or those high areas are not considered part of the plot of land. They're not measured together with it, and the seller will have to give even land somewhere else. I'll have to add on some more on some side in order to make up for that difference. You don't count those crevices or those rocks as part of the sale of the land. Pachot mikan nimdadin ima. However, if it's true there are crevices, but they are less than 10 tefachim deep, or there are rocks, but the rocks are less than 10 tefachim higher than the rest of the ground. In that case, they are included in the sale. So it can't be like too high or too low. They're not included. But even though it's rocks, or even though it's some kind of cleft, but it's not so deep, it's not so high, so those count as part of the bet kod. ואם אמר לו, כבית קוד עפר, אפילו היו שם נקעים עמוקים יותר מ10 טפחים, או סלעים כבוהים יותר מ10 טפחים, הרי אלו נמדדים עמها. However, if he says, I'm going to sell you about a bet kod, he didn't say exactly, so it's more or less. In that case, even if there were crevices that were deeper than 10 tefachim, or rocks that were higher than 10 tefachim, those are included in the measurement. Because by saying about that much, so he meant it's not going to be necessarily exact, and so that will include all these projections that are higher and lower. That's the Mishnah. Now we're going to compare this law in the Mishnah to another law that has to do with consecrating land. Tenan hatam. We learned in the Mishnah in Arachin. Hamakdish sadehu bish'at hayovel noten lo lebet zera chomer seorim 50 shekel kesef. If someone consecrates his land when the yovel is active, not nowadays, when we don't count the yovel right now, but when the law of the yovel was in effect, then if someone consecrates his property, his land, sometime during the yovel, he has, if he wants to redeem it, he could not redeem it, and then the Bet HaMikdash will keep it. But if he wants to redeem it before the yovel comes, he can. Now, how much does he have to pay? It's a fixed amount. It's not like making other things hekdesh. Other things we evaluate how much they're worth. It's expensive item, gold, whatever it's made out of. But in this case, it's a fixed amount no matter what the quality of the land is. And for every zera of chomer, a chomer is the same as a bet kod. So it's just a biblical word for it. So for this size of land, 50 shekel kesef, he has to redeem it with 50 shekel of kesef. Now that would include all of the yovel. So that would mean if he consecrated it and then redeemed it all in the very first year, right after the yovel, then he would have to pay 50. If he did it in the midway, he wanted to redeem it. It doesn't really matter when he consecrated it. He could have consecrated it in the first year, second year, and then in the 25th year, he decides he's going to redeem it. So since there are only 25 years left, so that would be 25 shekel. So one silver shekel per year for every bet kod. If he donates multiple bet kods, then he'll have to give that multiple of this amount. Hayu sham nekaim amukim 10 tefachim o selaim gebohim 10 tefachim. Now this is the reason we're bringing this in this Mishnah, because he uses the same language as our Mishnah here in Baba Batra. Let's say he donates some land, but on the land there are also some crevices that are deeper than 10 tefachim. Or there are rocks that are higher than 10 tefachim, and nimdadin imaha. Pachot mikan, nimdadin imaha. So if they're higher or lower than 10 tefachim, then they are not measured together with the rest of the field. But if it's less than that, then they are measured to get together with the rest of the field. So in other words, if you have these rocks that are higher than 10 tefachim, then those are not included in the consecration. And so when it comes to evaluate, I want to redeem my land, okay, so we're going to measure a bet kor. Measure a bet kor does not include those rocks. Those are kept out separately. And the rest of it, he will then he'll add a little more to some side so that he has a bet kor of more or less even land. Those rocks and stuff, there's machloket about what happens to them. One opinion is that they are consecrated, but he has to redeem them for the market price, whatever it is. They are useful. You could build a house on it, whatever. And some say that actually they're not consecrated at all. But the point is that they are not part of the consecration of the land. Now we ask, Ve'amai likadeshu ben pe nafshaihu. Now why are they not included in the consecration of the land? Why don't they get consecrated in and of themselves? It's easier to explain according to Rambam that says that they're not consecrated at all. So the question is, let's say I consecrated this land. So why aren't the rocks also consecrated? Maybe separately, so count them separately. But why do you say they're not consecrated at all? So maybe you'll say, the reason why those rocks, the projections, more than 10 tefachim, are not consecrated is because they don't all add up together to a bet kor. Rashbam, the first opinion here, can also explain this, mean that yes, they are consecrated separately, just like any item is consecrated, but they're not consecrated as land, and therefore they don't have this law of redemption according to this fixed amount. So why aren't they considered consecrated in and of themselves? So maybe you'll say because it doesn't add up to a bet kor. And so right now we're thinking that, let's say I have a relatively small piece of land, less than a bet kor, and I consecrate it. So then it doesn't get the consecration of this type that it would be redeemed through this fixed amount. Maybe you'll think that this law only applies when it's at least a bet kor or a multiple of that, 2 bet kor. It will apply to that also. It has to be more, but not less. And all the rocky areas altogether don't add up to a bet kor. Is that the reason? Can't be. V'hatanya sedeh ma tamud lomad lefi shenemar zera chomer seorim ב50 shekel kasef en li ela sheikdish be'inyan zeh minayin lerabot letech v'chasi letech se'ah tarkab v'chasi tarkab tamud lomar sedeh mikom makom. Let's look at the Pesukim for a moment so we can appreciate this midrash. So it says v'im misedeh achuzato yakdish ish ladonai. If someone consecrates part of his field, in that case, the estimation for redemption will be for every chomer of barley seed, 50 shekel of silver. That will be for the entire Yovel. So that's from the time of Yovel, and so on. But if it's after the Yovel, then you make a calculation according to the number of years left, and it will be that amount that you deduct from the 50. Okay, good. So since we have the word here, misedeh, and actually you have sadehu again in the next pasuk, but they're really not necessary because you can see that's talking about lefi zaro, according to how much seed you can grow on it. So therefore it's obvious that this is talking about land that can be used for growth. So now we ask, sadeh, why do we need that extra word? After all, we already says zera chomer seorim, which makes it clear that we're talking about a field, not land that you would use to build a house on or for other purposes. So the word sadeh comes to teach me the following: I would only know that this law applies to an entire chomer, an entire bet kor, like as the example is in the pasuk. How do you know that? Let's say I consecrated a smaller amount, just a letech of land or a half a letech of land. A letech is itself a half a kor, so a half of that or half of that, or just a se'ah, or just a tarkav, smaller pieces of land, or even a half a tarkav, how do you know that I also would redeem those pieces of land according to a ratio? It would be half of the amount or a quarter of the amount. So that's why the pasuk says sadeh. In all cases, any type of field, it doesn't have to be necessarily a bet kor. The Torah was just giving an example of this, of a chomer, and this would be a shekel kesef per chomer per year. But in fact, if it was less, then you would also have the same law. So back to our question. I understand that the rock is considered an independent area because it's higher than 10 amot and the crevices are lower than 10 amot. But why don't they become consecrated independently and then could be redeemed according to the fixed amount independently? And so you have the bet kor of land that you can sow. Okay, fine, that's all one area, and then take all the rocky areas and add them up all together, and then there'll be a separate area that also is consecrated and that you can redeem according to the fixed amount by ratio. So why not? Why does the Mishnah say that it's not included at all? Amar Rav Ukba bar Hama hacha b'nekim meleim mayim askinan dela b'neziri aninhu. Rav Ukva bar Chama explains that this Torah law in these Pesukim only apply to land that can be sown. As we just saw, that's the context of it, talking about land that you can put seed into. And therefore, that would explain easily why rocks cannot be included, because rocks you cannot plant things on. So rocks are not going to be included. Now what about crevices? Now even if it's a crevice and it's more than 10 tefachim deep, okay, so you can jump down there and you can sow seed over there. So Rav Ukbar bar Chama said, no, the crevices also, this Mishnah is talking only about when they are full of water, and therefore you cannot sow them at all. That's why it's excluded. But in fact, if it was arable land, then it would be included, even though it's 10 tefachim deep. So we have a new understanding now of this Mishnah, that in fact it doesn't really matter if it's 10 tefachim deep or not. The key distinction is, can it be sown or not? Any land that can be sown is included in this law, even if it's more than 10 tefachim deep. And I guess also if you had a rock that was high, an area that was high, but it was land and you can sow it, then that would also be included in the bet kor, and you can redeem it according to the standard amount. But what these two areas have in common is that you cannot plant on them. And in fact, this is a precise reading of the Mishnah, because the Mishnah gives two examples. It gives the crevice that's lower and the rock that's higher. So it means a crevice that is similar to a rock. How would it be similar to a rock? In that it's full of water, and therefore it cannot be sown at all. So therefore we conclude that only if it cannot be used at all, then it's not included in the consecration and redemption. Now that we have this understanding, you just said it doesn't actually matter if it's more than 10 tefachim or higher than 10 tefachim. All that matters is if you can sow it or not. Well, if so, then why does the Mishnah say that if it's less than 10 tefachim, then it is included, even if it's a rock, even if it's full of water? So now, how can you explain that? And the answer is Hanhu negane de'ara mikru, shidre de'ara mikru. Those areas, if it's just a little bit higher or a little bit lower, even though it's made out of rock, or even if it's full of water, these are not called separate areas, but rather they're simply called the cracks of the earth and the spines of the earth. Earth has a different topography in various places, and it's expected it's not going to be perfectly smooth and all arable. Within an arable plot of land, there's going to be some small areas that are not. So if they're under 10 tefachim, so then we just consider that part of the earth, it's all one thing. If it's more than 10 tefachim, see, more than 10 tefachim, high or low, makes it its own area, right? 10 tefachim is already like a wall, it's a mechitza, and that area is considered a separate area. If that separate area is one that you can plant on, then it will be included. But if it's higher than 10 tefachim, it's its own area, and you can't plant anything on that, in that case, it's not included in the consecration and redemption as part of this law, so that you could redeem it for the standard amount. Okay, all that was the analysis of the Mishnah in Arachin. We brought all that so we can ask the next two words. Hacha mai. What about in this case? Is this true also? Because we made a kind of a okimta on that Mishnah, that it's only if it's filled with water. Is that true here also? If I sell you a bet kod, a field, that's a bet kod, and it has some areas, crevices, that are full of water. So are those included or not in the sale? And what if they're not full of water? So over here, regarding arachin, we said they're not included if they're full of water, but if they're empty, then you can plant there, so then they are included. Is that distinction also true here? That you'd say, well, okay, if they're full of water, then no, they're not part of the sale, because that's like a rock. But maybe, but if they're not full of water, then the sale goes through. Would you say that? Or no matter what, they're not included in the sale? That's the question. Amar Papa, af al pi she'en mele'im mayim. The Papa says the law of our Mishnah here in Baba Batra is not the same as arachin. And over here, even if it's not full of water, it's not included in the sale. Even though it means 10 tefachim deep, even though you can sow in it, so you might think it should be part of the sale. No, the Papa says it's different. The definition is different in this case. Why? My tama en adam roseh shiten me'ota b'makom echad v'yeda'u lo kishnayim u'shlosha mekomot. Because here we have to. It depends on the psychology of the buyer, and a buyer is not going to want to pay good money, and he's paying to have one field. That's what he said. I want to buy one field. Right? I don't want to buy 2 or 3 separate fields. So he doesn't want to pay money for one field, and then he gets something that looks like it's 2 or 3 different plots of land. Why does it look like that? Well, because there's crevices and rocks that are very low and very high. And then it looks like 3 separate areas, 2 separate areas, however many. This is also inconvenient for him because when he's plowing, he wants to go straight through and use everything all at once. And so that's the reason here, that the buyer is expecting one more or less straight field that he can use. And this, even if the deeper parts are arable, nevertheless, because they're deeper, it looks like 2 different plots of land. And that's not the same as the law regarding arachin. There, the Torah says specifically, if you can sow it, then it's part of the redemption, the consecration and redemption. So there, only if it's full of water. Here, even if it's not full of water, it breaks the plot into 2, and therefore is not included in the sale. מתקיף לה רבינה, והדומיה דסלעים קטנה, מסרים דלה בנזרי ענינהו, אף הנאנמה דלה בנזרי ענינהו. However, Ravina challenges this reading based on what we said before. Before we said, oh, this is a precise reading of the Mishnah by comparing the clefts with the rocks. And it says, well, they're both the same, so that means they're both not arable. So here we're gonna ask the same question. But in the reading of our Mishnah, by saying the crevices right next to rocks, doesn't that mean that the crevices are similar to the rocks? And just like rocks, you cannot plant on them. So too, regarding crevices, it means a case where you cannot plant in them because they're full of water. So shouldn't you compare them? And the answer is, Ki katane dumya deselaim apachot mikan. It says, yes, I'm going to compare them, but that comparison does not apply to the resha, but rather only the sefa of the Mishnah. The sefa that says, if it's less than 10 tefachim, then it's included in the sale of the land. And that's true even if it's full of water. You might have thought, oh, if it's full of water, then it's completely unusable. Then it's not included in the sale, even if it's less than 10 tefachim deep, those crevices. And it says, no, we want to bring both examples to teach you, even if it's full of water, but it's not 10 deep, then it's included in the sale because it's the same as rocks, which also cannot be used for sowing at all. But nevertheless, if it's less than 10, it's included in the sale. So too would be true for a crevice that's less than 10 tefachim. The Gemara next analyzes the last part of the Mishnah that said, Pachot mikan nimdadin imaha. If there are crevices or rocks that are less than 10 tefachim high or higher or lower than the rest of the ground, then they are included in the measurement for the sale. If I sell you one bet kod, it can have a certain amount of rocks on it that are less than 10 tefachim. Now the question is, how much? How much of the land can be rocks that are less than 10 tefachim? So I give you, 99% of the land is rocks. So you say, well, there are less than 10 tefachim, so all that's included in the sale. You wanted to buy arable land, so it can't be the whole field. There has to be a limit. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Tedashim Shamru Bet Arba'at Kabin. And so Rabbi Yitzchak says, when we talk about rocks, they have to be a maximum of 4 kav per bet kor. That comes out to a ratio of 1 out of 45. So 1/45 of it can be rocks or less than that, but not more, because, even though, fine, they're less than 10 tefachim high, so fine, they're just like considered the spine of the land, but you can't have the land that's full of that. It has to be relatively little. Amar Rav Ukva bar Chama, v'hu shemuvla'in b'chameshet kabin. Rav Ukva bar Chama says, furthermore, let's say you have a rock that's 4 kav big. Can it be all in one place? He says, no, it cannot. It has to be a little bit spread out. Those 4 kav have to be some breaks in it, such that it takes up at least a space of 5 kav, which is not very much. It's still pretty concentrated, but it can't be one big rock. It has to be somewhat a little bit spread out. Dissenting opinion, Rav Chia bar Abba amar Rabbi Yochanan, v'hu shemuvla'in beruba shel sadeh. Rabbi Chia bar Abba says, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that these 4 kav have to be spread out throughout most of the field, right? They have to be all over the place. They have to be randomly scattered all over the field. So it's a ratio of 1 to 45, and it cannot be concentrated at all. It has to go all over throughout the field. Now we further analyze this. Ba'e Rav Chia bar Abba, Ruban b'mi'uta, u'mi'utan beruba, mahu teko. So Rabbi Chia bar Abba asks, what if it's not perfectly evenly distributed? A little rock here, a little rock there, every couple of feet. But what if there's most of the rock is in a minority of the field, and a minority of the amount of rock is on most of the field? For example, on this half of the field has 40% of the rocks, and the other half of the field has 60% of the rocks. They're not really evenly distributed. This small area has more, and a bigger area, or you could say 40% of the field has 60% of the rocks, and 60% of the field has 40% of the rocks, right? What about that? It's not very concentrated, but it's not totally evenly spread out, so we leave that question standing. Teko. Ba'e Rabbi Yirmiyah, kashir mahu, kishura mahu, itztadinin mahu, derech akalton mahu, teko. And next question of Rabbi Yirmiyah. So let's say, okay, they're not concentrated all in one spot. They are spread out, but they're spread out in a certain shape, like a ring. So imagine the screen is the field, and you have rocks that are scattered around, but they're all form a ring. So on the one hand, if you divide it in half this way or that way, so every corner, every section will have the same number of rocks, so the same ratio throughout. So in that sense, they're scattered. On the other hand, they're not totally scattered throughout because they are making a shape, so they're only in that circle. So what about that? Or keshura, what if they're in a row? So going right through the field is a row of rocks. So then on the one hand, they're not concentrated all in one spot in any, in one big rock in the middle. So they are scattered along the length of it. On the other hand, they're not totally scattered all around. So is that considered scattered enough or not? Or what if it's the shape of an angle? So an angle, something like this, so that it starts here, and something that looks like maybe an ox standing on legs. So it starts at a small point and spreads out this way and that way. So do you consider that to be spread out? Because it's pretty spread out, right? It's like kind of, all in different areas. On the other hand, it's not totally spread out. There's a lot of areas that don't have any rock in them. Or akalton, if it's a crooked path. So what about, it just makes a zigzag all around, which is more spread out, but not totally spread out. So what about all these cases? Teko, we leave them unresolved. Tana, im haya sela yechidi, afilu kolshehu en nimdad imaha. Im haya samuch lemeser, afilu kolshehu en nimdad imaha. Now, Braita adds that when you say that you can have some rocks here and there, that's only if it's in the middle of the land, but not at the edge. So if there's a single rock, and it's basically right outside the boundary, then even a small rock like that is not going to be included. And even if it's within the boundary, but it's adjacent, it's butting up right up to the boundary, and you have a rock there, even that tiniest rock will not be included. So we only include rocks if they're in the middle. We say, okay, while you're walking, there's the spine of it, and there's small crevices. Fine, that's just part of the topography. But that's only in the middle when they're surrounded by earth. But if they're at the edge, then they are not included. Ba'era papa, mufsak afar bentayim mahu. Papa says, well, what if they're not totally on the edge? There's a little bit of dirt between the border and that rock. How about that? Is that considered on the border and it's not included? Or, well, since there's a little bit of dirt around it, then that's considered within the field, and it will be counted in it. Teko, we leave that question standing. Rav Asher, afar milimata v'sunma milimala, afar milimala v'sunma milimata, mahu teko. And last question, Rav Asher asks, what if there is a rock, but it's above some dirt? So there's some dirt, and then it's a little mound, and then on top of that, there's a rock. So would we say that the earth, below it, makes that rock considered part of the land? What about the opposite case, where there is dirt on top, but there's a rock below it? So do we say, oh, look, there's a rock below it, so that is not going to count? Or since it's covered by dirt, so then it's considered with dirt, so then it does count, and we leave this question standing as well. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen.